The moment Caleb Rowan stepped through those saloon doors and saw a woman standing on a crate with her wrists bound and her chin raised like she was daring the whole town to break her, he didn't think. He reached into his coat, pulled out every coin he had, and dropped it on the table without a single word. That was the day two ruined people found each other in the worst possible way. If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The summer in Duskwater, Colorado was the kind that burned everything it touched. The sun came down hard on the main street, cracking the dry dirt into pale plates that crunched under boot heels. The air smelled of coal dust and horse sweat, and something older. The particular smell of a town that had long since stopped trying to be decent. Caleb Rowan had ridden into Duskwater twice before, once for supplies, once to collect a debt owed to him by a man who no longer breathed. Both times he had left quickly, the way a man does when a place makes the skin on the back of his neck pull tight. This third time was supposed to be the same. He needed flour cartridges and a new blade for the skinning knife he'd snapped 2 weeks back against a frozen elk bone. That was all. He'd ride in before midday, be back up the mountain pass before supper, and the cabin would go on as it always did, quiet cold in the mornings, even in summer, and mercifully empty of other people's problems. He tied his horse outside the general store and heard the noise before he understood what it was. It was coming from the Red Creek Saloon, which sat diagonal across the street, a wide rotting building with a porch that listed slightly to the left, and a sign that had faded so badly the name was barely legible. But the building didn't need a sign to announce itself. The noise said everything. Voices rough and layered the way a crowd gets when it thinks it's watching something entertaining. Caleb stood still for a moment. He knew that sound. It was the sound of people deciding something about someone who had no say in the matter. He crossed the street. He pushed through the saloon doors and stopped just inside the threshold, letting his eyes adjust from the white summer glare to the dim interior. The room was packed, maybe 40 men, some women along the walls, a few children who should not have been there. Every face was turned toward the far end of the bar. There was a wooden crate pushed up against the counter. Standing on top of it was a young woman. Her wrists were tied in front of her with rough rope, the kind used for hitching horses. Her dress, pale blue once, was dirty at the hem and torn at the right sleeve. Her hair had come mostly loose from whatever she'd pinned it in that morning, and dark strands hung across her face and neck. Her feet were bare on the raw wood of the crate, but her chin was up. That was the thing Caleb noticed first before anything else. Her chin was up, and her jaw was set, and her eyes, dark brown, clear as anything, were moving slowly across the room, like she was memorizing faces. Not crying, not begging, just looking. The way a person looks when they've decided the only dignity they have left is the act of witnessing what's being done to them. Beside the crate stood a man Caleb didn't know. Thin, somewhere in his 30s, with a gambler's vest that had seen better days, and the particular restless hands of a man in debt. He was talking fast, working the crowd, the way a street seller works a market. Sound in both lungs, I swear it, gentlemen. Doc Paris looked her over, not 3 months back, and she's fit as any woman in this county. Knows her letters, can cook, can keep a house. She ain't trouble. She's an investment. Someone from the crowd called out something crude. Laughter. The woman on the crate didn't flinch. She found the man who'd spoken in the crowd and held his gaze until he looked away. Caleb felt something move in him that he had spent 3 years training himself not to feel. He pressed it down and looked at the man with the gambler's vest. "Who is that?" he asked the man standing nearest to him. The man turned, looked at Caleb, the way everyone eventually looked at Caleb. That half-second hesitation, when the full size of him registered the assessment of the guns at his hip, the quick recalibration of how politely to speak. "That's Jeb Collins," the man said. "Got himself into a bad hand of cards with Silas Varnell's boys 3 nights running. Lost everything he had. Apparently decided everything he had included his sister." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "His sister," he said. "That's right. Name's Mary Ellison. She took their mother's name after the father passed. Jeb Collins put her up this morning like she was a mule at a livestock auction. The man shook his head, but he was still watching the crate, still part of the crowd, which told Caleb everything about what the man's shaking head actually meant. Terrible business. Caleb said. He looked back at the woman. Mary Ellison. Jeb Collins was still talking. Starting bid is $40, which is less than she's worth. I'll tell you that, but I need this settled today, and I'm a reasonable man. You're a coward, the woman on the crate said. The room went momentarily quiet. Jeb Collins turned to look at her. His jaw tightened. Mary, say it to their faces, Jeb. Her voice was steady, a little rough, like she'd been crying before she got here, and had simply stopped. Tell them you lost $200 playing cards with men who were cheating you, and instead of asking for help, you decided I was worth more to you as a transaction than as a sister. Say that part. Jeb Collins took a step toward the crate. You keep quiet or I swear. Or you'll what, she said. Sell me twice. A few people in the crowd laughed. The uncomfortable kind of laugh. The kind that happens when someone says something so true it comes out sideways. Jeb turned back to the crowd, redness climbing up his neck. $40, he said again, louder. Who's starting? A hand went up. Then another. Caleb moved to the bar. He didn't push anyone. He didn't need to. He was 6'4" and built from years of mountain winters and the kind of work that doesn't stop because a man is tired and people simply moved out of the path he made without being asked. He reached the bar, and the bartender looked at him with the wariness of a man who'd learned to read the room and wasn't sure what this particular room was about to do. You got a safe? Caleb asked. What? In the back. You got a safe. Yeah, but what's in it? The bartender blinked. What business is that of? I'm asking what you'd take for the contents of the safe. I don't. The bartender stared at him. Mister, I can't just. Caleb reached into the inside breast pocket of his coat and pulled out a canvas bag. He set it on the bar. It landed with a weight and sound that was unmistakable. How much? Caleb said. The bidding behind him had reached $60. A man with a red beard was raising his hand again. The bartender looked at the bag, looked at Caleb, swallowed. There's about 110, maybe 120 in there. End of last week's. Fine, Caleb said. He opened the canvas bag and began counting out coin onto the bar. Add 60 more, and that's 180. That ends the bidding. Mister, I can't just give you the contents of. I'm not asking for the contents, Caleb said, still counting. I'm using this as a number. What would end this whole proceeding right now, immediately, with no further discussion? The bartender stared at him. Behind Caleb, the bidding hit $70. 200? The bartender said very quietly. 200 ends it. That's what Varnell's man said would clear the whole debt. Caleb stopped counting. He put the partially counted coins back in the bag, reached into his coat again, and pulled out a second smaller bag. He upended both onto the bar, pushed the combined pile toward the bartender, and looked at him. Count it, he said. Aye, sir. Count it. The bartender counted with shaking hands. His lips moved. He reached the end of the pile and looked up. That's $214, he said. Then we're done, Caleb said. He turned around. The room was watching him now. The bidding had stopped. Jeb Collins was staring with his mouth slightly open. The red-bearded man still had his hand in the air, apparently not having received word that the moment had passed. Caleb walked to the center of the room and looked at Jeb Collins. Debt's paid, he said. In full, Ed. Jeb Collins opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the bartender who was still standing behind the bar, looking somewhat stricken. The bartender gave a small, helpless nod. Now, Caleb said, untie her. Jeb didn't move immediately, and in that pause, something happened in the room, a shift in temperature. The collective sense of 40 people deciding all at once that they would very much rather not be in the path of what this man might do next. Jeb walked to the crate and untied Mary's wrists. She stepped down from the crate without taking the hand he offered. She stood in the middle of the saloon and looked at Caleb. He was already looking at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the room held its breath. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "Why did you do that?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because somebody needed to." She studied him. Her eyes moved across his face like she was trying to read a language she'd only heard about. "What do you want in return?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, the kind of bracing a person does when they expect the worst. "Nothing," he said. "Men don't spend $200 on nothing." "This one does." He reached up and touched the brim of his hat briefly. "You got somewhere to go, miss." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at Jeb Collins. Jeb Collins was staring at the floor. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." Caleb nodded once the way a man does when he's made a decision that he knows he's going to have to live with. "I've got a cabin," he said, "up on the north face of the Rockmore Pass. It's 2 days' ride from here. I go back today. And you're offering me a roof until you figure out what's next." He met her eyes. "That's all I'm offering." Mary looked at him for a long time. Around them, the saloon had gone very quiet. 40 people were listening to two strangers negotiate the terms of a life, and nobody seemed inclined to interfere. "You'll have to give me your word," she said. "My word on what?" That's all it is." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Caleb looked at her, at the rope marks, still red on her wrists, at the torn sleeve, at the bare feet on the dirty saloon floor, and something in his face shifted just barely, like a door opening an inch. "You have it," he said. She held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then she turned to Jeb Collins, and when she looked at her brother, something crossed her face that was worse than anger. It was the particular sorrow of a person burying something they'd hoped to keep alive. "Don't come looking for me," she said. Jeb Collins didn't answer, didn't look up. Mary turned back to Caleb and lifted her chin. "Then let's go," she said. They were out of Duskwater by early afternoon. Caleb rode his dark bay horse Atlas, who was old enough to be reliable and stubborn enough to be trustworthy. He'd borrowed a mare from the livery paid for 3 days, but he'd return her tomorrow, he said, and the liveryman had nodded without argument, because something about the set of Caleb Rowan's face suggested that when he said he'd return a horse, he meant it. Mary rode the mare and did not speak for the first hour. Caleb didn't push it. He knew what silence was, what it did, why people needed it. He'd lived inside silence for 3 years and come to understand it the way you understand a piece of country you've crossed 100 times. Silence had textures. The silence of a person who had nothing to say was different from the silence of a person holding something too big to carry and too precious to set down. Mary Ellison's silence was the second kind. When they stopped to let the horses drink at a creek crossing, she finally spoke. "My mother was a doctor's assistant for 15 years, she said, not looking at him. "Helped him with everything. Surgeries, medicines, deliveries. I grew up watching, learning." She paused. "She died 2 winters ago. Fever. The doctor said it was ironic. Caleb didn't say it wasn't." "I'm sorry," he said instead. She looked at the water. "After she died, my father fell apart. Lost the house, the savings. Jeb had already moved back home by then. He'd failed at everything else, and he gambled because he said it was the only thing that made him feel like he was still in the game." A short pause. "After father died, it was just the 2 of us. I kept working. I took in mending, helped the doctor when he needed extra hands. Jeb kept gambling." She stopped again. "You don't have to tell me," Caleb said. "I know." She looked at him, then direct and clear. "I want to. I want someone to know the truth of it, because I suspect that man in there is going to tell some other version of it to whoever asks." She looked back at the creek. He owed $200 to Silas Varnell's operation. Varnell sent men to the house. Jeb told them he had an asset. She said the word flatly, like a blade laid sideways. "That's what he called me, an asset." Caleb was quiet for the moment. Then he said, "Who is Silas Varnell?" Silver mine up in the northern ridge. Owns half the county and wants the other half. Ruthless man. Runs everything through other people so his name stays clean. She paused. He's not going to be happy that his money went somewhere he didn't intend. Caleb looked at her. You think he'll come after it? I think he'll come after whatever he believes he's owed, she said carefully. The money was a means to an end for him. The end was me. She let that sit for a moment. I don't know exactly why. I've been trying to figure that out since this morning. Caleb said nothing for a long time. The creek moved over the rocks. Atlas dipped his nose again and blew. Can you ride? Caleb finally asked. I rode here, didn't I? Can you ride hard if you need to? She looked at him. Yes. He nodded and turned his horse back to the trail. Then let's make time while we have light. The trail up toward the Rockmore Pass was not a trail that appeared on any maps drawn for ordinary travelers. It was the kind of path that existed because one man had used it enough times that the mountain had accepted the arrangement. It wound up through scrub oak and pine, past granite outcrops that jutted like broken teeth across two creek crossings where the water ran fast and cold, even in summer, and through a long, narrow channel between two cliff faces that Caleb called the shoulder. Mary watched him navigate it with the ease of a man walking a familiar room in the dark. How long have you been up here? She asked somewhere in the second hour of climbing. 3 years, he said from ahead of her. Before that? A pause. Army surgeon. Before that, general practice. Before that, a young man in Virginia who thought medicine would fix more than it could. Mary was quiet for a moment, processing this. You're a doctor. Was. Why did you stop? He didn't answer right away. The trail curved around an outcrop and opened briefly to a view of the valley below Duskwater, visible as a cluster of miniature buildings in the wide summer heat, the creek a silver thread beside it. Lost someone I should have saved, he said finally. Decided I was done deciding who lived. Mary looked at the valley for a moment. And then you went and spent $200 on a stranger in a saloon, she said. Something shifted in the set of his shoulders, just barely. Don't read too much into it, he said. I'm not reading anything into it, she said. I'm just noting the contradiction. He didn't answer. The trail curved back into the trees, and the valley disappeared. They reached the cabin after dark on the first night, stopping only once to camp Caleb building a fire that was small and practical, and exactly what was needed, Mary taking the bedroll he handed her without comment. The cabin was built low and solid against the mountain face, set into a natural shelf of rock that protected it from wind on 3 sides. It was bigger than she'd expected. One main room, a storage room, a lean-to for the horses. Everything inside was ordered with the precision of a man who lived alone, and had stopped seeing the point of disorder. She stood in the doorway and looked around. It's clean, she said. Dirt is a problem up here, he said, setting down his packs. Brings pests. Pests cause damage. I don't have the patience for damage. She looked at the shelves along the wall, medical texts she noticed arranged by spine. A copy of Gray's Anatomy, so worn the cover had separated from the binding. Jars of dried herbs she recognized. A locked cabinet that she was almost certain contained medicines. You said you were done practicing medicine, she said. I am. Then why? In case, he said flatly, and began unpacking provisions. Mary looked at the shelves for another moment. Then she turned and helped him unpack without being asked. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. They ate in the kind of silence that had moved somewhere between Duskwater and here, from the silence of strangers to the silence of people who were still deciding what they were to each other. Cornbread from what he had left cured meat coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. When she was done eating, Mary said, What do you need from me for staying here? Caleb looked up. You said a roof and nothing else, she said, holding his gaze steadily. I believe you, but I don't stay somewhere and contribute nothing. So what is it that you need help with that you haven't been able to do yourself? He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd said something wrong. I've been trying to expand the storage room, he finally said. "I need to shore up the east wall before winter. I can't do the interior work and hold the supports at the same time." He said it the way a man says something he's been practical enough to admit, but still finds slightly uncomfortable to say out loud. "And the kitchen garden hasn't produced well this summer. I don't have the patience for plants." Mary nodded once. "I can do both of those things," she said. "You know construction. I know basic structure. My father built our house from plans, and I watched every bit of it." She paused. "And I was raised by a woman who grew a kitchen garden in hard mountain soil in Vermont. Colorado won't be worse." Something very small moved across Caleb Rowan's face. If she'd been looking anywhere else, she would have missed it. It was not a smile exactly. It was the expression of a man who had expected less and gotten more, and didn't quite know what to do with that yet. "All right," he said. "Whoa." The first week passed in the way of first weeks between two cautious people carefully, with a great deal of attention paid to the management of space. Caleb rose before dawn every morning. By the time Mary was up, he had already been outside for 2 hours, doing whatever the mountain required of him, checking traps, cutting wood, repairing something or other. He left coffee on the stove. She thought about that. The coffee. He didn't mention it. It was just there. She started in on the garden the second day. It was in worse shape than he'd described. The soil was poor and packed, and someone at some point had planted things in the wrong order, so that they were fighting each other for water. She spent 3 days reworking it from the ground, talking to the plants. A little while she worked the way her mother had. On the 4th day she was deep in the soil when she heard him stop walking behind her. She looked up. He was standing with an armload of cut timber watching her talk to a tomato plant. "It helps," she said without embarrassment. "Does it?" he said. "My mother said plants respond to attention. Whether or not that's botanical fact, the act of paying attention to something makes you better at caring for it." She sat back on her heels. She was right about most things. He stood there for a moment. Then he said, "She sounds like she was a good doctor." Mary looked at him. "She would have been. They didn't let her be one." She turned back to the garden. "So she became the best assistant she could and taught everything she knew to me." Caleb was quiet. Then he set the timber down nearby and said, "Come look at the east wall when you're done there. I want to show you what I'm trying to do." She finished with the plants and went to look at the east wall. He explained the problem clearly and precisely, the kind of explaining that a man does when he respects the person he's explaining to. He showed her where the supports needed to go, what he could do from the outside, what needed a second pair of hands from inside. "I can hold those," she said, pointing. "They'll be heavy." "I know what heavy is," she said, looking at him directly. He looked back at her for a moment. Then he handed her the support beams. They worked the east wall for 4 days. He worked from the outside, she from the inside, and they developed the wordless communication of two people doing a physical task together, signals given by the movement of lumber, by a hand held up by the sound of a nail finding its mark. It was the most practical intimacy she'd experienced in years, and something about it settled her in a way she hadn't expected. On the evening of the 4th day, when the wall was solid, and they were both sitting on the porch, with the kind of tired that lives in the shoulders and hands, he said without looking at her, "You held the northeast corner steady for 6 minutes without shifting." "I counted," she said. A pause. "Most men couldn't do that." "Most men don't need to," she said. He was quiet. Then quietly, "Thank you." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the mountain, at the last light pulling away from the peaks to the west. "You're welcome," she said. It was the end of the 2nd week when the first rider came. Caleb saw him from the high trail, a single man riding slow, coming up the access path with the particular casualness of someone who wants to appear unthreatening. He came down from the trail and met the man at the base of the property line. The man was young 30s, with Silas Varnell's silver mine brand on his saddlebag. He smiled when he saw Caleb, which was the wrong move. "Evening," the man said. "Looking for a woman. Mary Ellison. Heard she might have come this way." "You heard wrong." Caleb said. The man's smile didn't waver. Mr. Varnell's very interested in her whereabouts. There was a financial arrangement. The financial arrangement was cleared, Caleb said. Every cent of it. You can take that word back to Varnell. Mr. Varnell's position is that the money was owed to him, but what he was buying wasn't the money. The man let that settle. He had a specific interest in the woman. The money was incidental. Caleb looked at him for a long, steady moment. You're going to want to turn that horse around, he said. And you're going to want to do it before I finish the sentence I'm forming. The man studied Caleb's face clearly, trying to determine whether this was a negotiating position or a statement of fact. He made the right call. Mr. Varnell will hear about this, he said, pulling his horse around. I expect he will, Caleb said. He watched the rider go until he was out of sight around the lower bend. Then he stood for a moment in the summer quiet, looking down the mountain, turning something over in his mind. He went back to the cabin. Mary was inside at the table, and she looked up when he came in. She read his face in about 2 seconds, which he had already noticed was a habit of hers that was disconcerting and probably useful. Someone from Varnell, she said. It was not a question. Yes. She set down what she was doing. He's not going to stop, she said. You should know that. I know that. Then you know I need to tell you something I should have told you in Duskwater. She looked at him steadily. The reason Varnell wanted me specifically. It's not what it looks like. Caleb sat down across from her at the table. Outside the window, the mountain summer was throwing long golden light across everything, and it was beautiful, and neither of them were looking at it. Then tell me what it is, he said. Mary looked at her hands, then at him. My father's land, she said. Before the mine, before Varnell bought up everything around it, there was a parcel in the northern ridge that my father homesteaded. He registered it properly with the territorial office years ago. He was the first. Varnell's operation runs across part of that parcel, now has been for 2 years, and Varnell knows the title is still in my family's name. She paused. Jeb was too deep in cards to care. He would have signed anything, but I wouldn't. Another pause. So Varnell got what he thought was the next best thing. Caleb was quiet for the long time. He wanted to own you so you'd have no choice, he said finally. That's one way to say it. She looked at him. So now you understand the full weight of what you walked into in that saloon. He met her eyes. Does it change anything about the arrangement? She searched his face. Does it change anything for you? He thought about it. Not the quick automatic thinking of a man performing reassurance. The real kind, the slow, honest accounting that a man does when he wants to know what he actually means before he says it. No, he said. Something in Mary Ellison's face shifted like a knot going loose. Then I'll tell you everything, she said. All of it, because you need to know what's coming up this mountain. Yes, Caleb said. I do. And the evening light came through the window and lay across the table between them, and somewhere down below, a man was riding back to tell Silas Varnell that the woman wasn't coming easy. And up in the cabin on the north face of the Rockmore Pass, 2 ruined people sat across a table and began for the first time to actually talk. Mary told him everything that night. She started with the land, the 40-acre parcel her father had registered in 1869 with the Colorado Territorial Land Office, a piece of the northern ridge that sat above the creek line and below the granite shelf where Varnell's men had been pulling silver for 2 years. Her father had been a careful man. He'd kept every document, every receipt, every surveyor's notation in a tin box under the floorboards of their house in Duskwater. He'd known even then that the land was worth something. He just hadn't known how much or what kind of man would eventually want it. Silas Varnell had arrived in the county 4 years ago with capital from somewhere back east that nobody asked too many questions about. He'd bought up parcels fast, the way a man does when he already knows what's underneath the ground before the owners do. He'd gotten everything he wanted except one thing. The Ellison parcel. Father refused to sell 3 times, Mary said. Varnell sent lawyers. Father sent them back. Then Father got sick, and Varnell sent a man named Galt, who told Father he could make the dying easier or harder depending on what he signed. She paused. Father told Galt to leave his house, and then he died 2 months later with every document still in that tin box. "Where's the tin box now?" Caleb asked. Mary looked at him steadily. "Hidden, in a place that isn't the house. Jeb doesn't know where it is. Jeb never knew it existed." She folded her hands on the table. "I made sure of that." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "So Varnell's been running his operation on land he doesn't own for 2 years, and recently the silver vein they're working crossed further onto our parcel. I know because one of the miners, a man named Tibbs, who was friends with my father, came to tell me 2 months ago. He said Varnell's operation was pulling ore from ground that legally belongs to the Ellison estate." She let that land. If anyone ever brought that to a territorial court, Varnell would lose not just the parcel, but potentially everything he's built on top of it. The claims overlap. It would unravel. "And Jeb's gambling debt gave Varnell a way to make that problem disappear," Caleb said. "He didn't want to buy me," Mary said, and there was something flat and precise in the way she said it. "He wanted to own me. Owning me means I sign whatever he puts in front of me. It means the documents in that box become worthless. It means he gets clean title to everything." She looked at him. "That's what you walked into in that saloon." Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Where are the documents?" he asked. "With someone I trust." "In Duskwater?" "No." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "All right," he said. He didn't push it further. She noticed that. "You're not going to ask me again," she said. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight it's enough to know they exist, and you know where they are." Mary looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Most men would push." "Most men," Caleb said, standing and taking his coffee cup to the basin, "don't know when to leave a thing alone." He stopped with his back to her. "You've been protecting those documents for 2 years. You're not going to tell a stranger in one night just because he bought you out of a saloon." "You're not a stranger anymore," she said quietly. He turned slightly just his head. He looked at her over his shoulder with those burned steel eyes, and for one moment something moved in them that she couldn't quite name. Then he turned back to the basin. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll have more to deal with tomorrow." She did not sleep well, but she slept. The more to deal with came faster than either of them expected. Caleb was up before dawn as always, and he was checking the upper trap line when he heard it. Not a rider, not horses, something else. A sound out of place in the way that only sounds out of place when a man has lived alone somewhere long enough to know what belongs and what doesn't. He came back to the cabin fast. Mary was already outside when he got there, standing very still on the porch listening. "You heard it too," he said. "Something in the tree line to the east," she said. "About 2 minutes ago. It stopped when I came outside." He stood beside her, and they both listened. The morning was early enough that the birds weren't fully going yet, and the silence had a kind of alert quality to it, the same quality a field gets when something large has moved through it recently. "Go inside," Caleb said. "I can—" "Please," he said. The word was quiet and direct, and not unkind. She went inside. She went to the east-facing window and watched. He moved around the cabin perimeter with the particular economy of a man who had learned to move through uncertain spaces. No wasted motion, no noise, body angled to present the smallest profile. He disappeared around the east corner. Mary stood at the window and counted her own heartbeats. At 43, he came back around the south corner with someone in front of him. A boy couldn't have been more than 16, thin with trail dust thick on his clothes, and the specific look of someone who had been moving through wilderness for longer than was comfortable. The boy was holding his hands slightly away from his body, in the universal language of, "I am not a threat, please believe me." Caleb walked him to the porch steps and stopped. Mary came outside. "Says his name is Pete Harker," Caleb said, looking at her. "Says he knows you." Mary looked at the boy and something changed in her face. Immediately recognition, and behind it, alarm. "Pete, what are you doing here? Mrs. Ellison." "Miss Mary." The boy was breathing hard like he'd been running. "Tibbs sent me. He said to find you wherever you'd gone, said it was worth the trouble." He stopped to catch his breath. "Varnell's men came to Tibbs' place 3 days ago, looking for the documents. Tibbs hid them, but they roughed him up pretty good. He's okay. He's okay, but they told him if the papers didn't surface in 2 weeks, they'd come back and the conversation would go differently." Mary's jaw tightened. "How did they know Tibbs had them?" "They didn't, not for certain, but Tibbs thinks someone saw you leave his place before all this happened and put it together." Pete glanced at Caleb, then back at Mary. "He says you need to get those papers to the territorial office in Crestfield before Varnell gets to the filing clerk. Varnell's been paying the clerk to flag anything related to the Ellison parcel. If Varnell gets there first, he files a fraudulent transfer," Mary said, "and suddenly I signed something I never signed. Tibbs says he's got enough left of the bruises to testify if he needs to, but he needs you to file first. The clerk that Varnell owns is out sick. His replacement comes in Monday." Pete looked at her with the seriousness of a 16-year-old delivering news he fully understands. "Today's Thursday, Miss Mary." 4 days. Caleb looked at Mary. Mary looked back at him. "Where are the documents?" he asked. This time it was not a question he was going to leave alone. Mary held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she said, "Tibbs has the originals, but I made copies. I have mine." "Where?" She was still looking at him, reading him the way she'd been doing since that first day. Then she turned and went inside, and when she came back, she was carrying a flat leather satchel that had been sewn into the lining of a larger bag, the kind of concealment that required patience and planning, and someone who had expected to need it. She held it out to him. He took it carefully, opened it, looked at the papers inside: surveyor maps, registration documents, land office stamps, dates going back 14 years. Everything a territorial court would need. "This is enough," he said. "With Tibbs's originals, this is enough to establish clear title and contest Varnell's claims." "Can we get to Crestfield in 4 days?" Mary asked. Caleb looked at her. Then he looked at Pete. "Boy, you got a horse. Rode it nearly lame getting here," Pete said. "She needs 2 days rest." "She'll get one," Caleb said. "You can stay here tonight and tomorrow morning. Then you go home by the South Trail, slower but safer. You tell Tibbs we're moving." "Yes, sir," Pete said. Then, with the directness of a teenager who'd been raised to be useful, "Are you going to be enough against Varnell's men?" Caleb looked at him for a moment. "Go eat something," he said. "There's food inside." Pete went inside. Caleb turned to Mary. She was already watching him. "You know the Crestfield Road," he said. "I've ridden it twice," she said. "It goes northeast along the ridge before it drops into the valley. 2 days in 1 day to the town, 1 day back, that's tight." "We leave tomorrow before light," he said. "We move fast, and we don't stop in any town long enough to be noticed." "Varnell will have men watching the road," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's why we don't take the road." She looked at him. "You know another way." "I know the mountain," he said simply. "Varnell's men know roads." For a moment Mary looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the measuring look, not the careful, steady assessment she'd been wearing since the saloon. Something more complicated. Something that was trying very hard not to be hope and wasn't entirely succeeding. "All right," she said. "We go tomorrow." "Yes," he said. And then, because he was Caleb Rowan, and he said the thing that needed saying, whether or not it was comfortable, "This is going to get harder before it gets better." "I know that," she said. "I need you to know it for real, not bravely, for real." She met his eyes. "My brother sold me to a man's debt. I hid my family's legal documents in a bag lining and spent 2 years waiting for this exact situation." Her voice was quiet and absolute. "I know what hard is, Caleb." It was the first time she'd used his name. He heard it. Something in the lines of his face shifted, the same, almost invisible shift she'd been cataloging since the first day, each one a small measure of something changing. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I reckon you do." They left before the sky was anything other than dark gray. Pete still sleeping on the floor by the stove, with his boots on. Caleb had left enough food out for him, and a note written in the plain direct hand of a man who didn't believe in unnecessary words that said, "South Trail. Don't stop in Harrow Creek. Tell Tibbs 10 days. Atlas moved well in the early dark, and the mare, whose name Mary had decided was Clara because she needed a name, was rested enough to be steady. They moved up through the back of the property and into the high trail that Caleb knew by feel as much as sight, the one that ran along the spine of the ridge above the tree line, where anyone watching from below would need a very specific kind of luck to spot them. Mary rode without complaint. She kept pace. When the trail narrowed and she had to navigate a rocky crossing that was harder than it looked, she did it without asking for help, though she accepted his hand on one stretch where the footing was genuinely treacherous, and refusing, it would have been pride over sense. She held the hand for the span of 3 steps and then let it go. He didn't mention it. She was grateful. "Tell me about before," she said somewhere in the first hour. "Before the mountain. You said army surgeon." He was quiet for a moment. "Served through most of the conflict. Field surgery. You learn things in field surgery that you'd rather not know." "Like what?" "Like how fast a man's perspective changes when the thing he's trying to save is right there in front of him." He paused. "In a hospital, you can be distant, clinical. In a field tent with the noise happening outside and a man bleeding on your table, you can't be distant. You're just there. Completely there." "Is that bad?" "It's the only honest way to do it," he said. "But it costs." Mary rode and thought about that. "What happened after you said you lost someone you should have saved?" The trail crested a rise, and the pre-dawn landscape opened on either side of them, vast and dark and enormous. "My wife," he said, "and my daughter." The words were simple and quiet, and hit Mary like a stone dropped into still water. "I was back from service," he continued, and his voice didn't change, which she understood was not absence of feeling, but the long practice of a man who had learned to carry something and keep moving. "Set up practice in a town called Rikers Bluff. Small place. Good people. There was a fire in the building next to ours on a night I was out on a call." A pause. "By the time I got back, the building was gone. By the time it was over..." He stopped. Started again. "I was the town doctor. I had all the tools. I had the training. And I was on the wrong side of town." "It wasn't your fault," Mary said, because she had to say it because it was true. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't. But fault isn't the only thing that breaks a man." He paused. "I couldn't stay in that town. Couldn't practice. Every time I picked up a tool, I thought about the one time having every tool available made no difference at all." A longer pause. "So I came up here. Figured I'd live in a place where the only life I was responsible for was mine." Mary was quiet for a long moment, and then a woman stood on a crate in a saloon, she said. He didn't answer right away. Then very quietly, "Yeah." "I'm sorry," she said. "For your wife, for your daughter. I'm sorry." "Thank you," he said, and it sounded like he meant it. They rode in silence for a while, but it was a different silence now, not the silence of withholding, but of two people who had set something down between them and were figuring out how to walk around it. By mid-morning, they were moving through country that felt increasingly remote, the high trail narrowing the air, thinning slightly, the sounds of ordinary settlement dropping away behind them. And then Caleb pulled Atlas up short and held up his hand. Mary stopped immediately. She heard it. Horses. Below and to the south. Moving but not fast, the careful movement sound of riders trying not to make noise, which made more noise than ordinary riding. "How many?" she breathed. "3, he said. "Maybe 4. "How did they—" "They're not following us," he said low and even. "They're moving parallel, trying to get ahead of us." He looked at the terrain, working something out. "They know the Crestfield Road. They're trying to cut us off at the Harrow Fork before we can hit the valley." "You said we weren't taking the road." "We're not." He looked at her. "But whoever told them we were moving knew we were heading to Crestfield, and they knew why." Mary went very still. "Pete," she said. "Or Tibbs, or someone who saw Pete leave." He shook his head. "Doesn't matter right now. What matters is, there are riders trying to box us in, and we've got to change our line." He studied the terrain above them. "There's a cut through the rock formation about half a mile north. Comes out above the Harrow Fork. We'd be above them when they arrive, not in front of them." "That works," she said, "as long as we're faster." "On these horses on this trail we're faster," he said. "Can you push?" "Push," she said. They pushed. It was not comfortable riding the kind that asks everything of both the horse and the person on it, that demands complete attention and offers nothing back but the necessity of forward motion. Clara proved herself on that half-mile, picking her way with a sureness that vindicated Caleb's choice of her from the livery. Mary rode flat and low and fast, and didn't drop the pace once. They came through this cut above the Harrow Fork with enough time to pull back into the shadow of the rock face and wait. 4 riders came through the fork below them 7 minutes later. Moving in a controlled column, armed, scanning the trail ahead with the specific attention of men who expect to find something and are annoyed they haven't yet. Mary and Caleb pressed still and silent against the rock and watched them pass below. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She kept her breathing slow. Caleb was watching the riders with the expression of a man running calculations. He waited until the sound of hooves faded. Then he said quietly, "When we get to Crestfield, we're not stopping overnight." "File and leave," she said. "File and leave," he agreed. "We get in, we get to the land office, we file everything, we get back on the road." He looked at her. "Varnell's going to know what we're doing the moment those riders report back that we weren't on the Crestfield Road. He'll move fast." "How fast?" "Fast enough that 2 days back up the mountain is going to feel very long," Caleb said. Mary looked at the empty trail below where the riders had passed. Then she looked at him. "Then we'd better not waste time," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Really looked the way he did sometimes when she'd done or said something that recalibrated something for him. "You're not scared," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm terrified," she said. "But I spent 2 years being terrified in a house in Duskwater waiting for something to happen. I'd rather be terrified moving toward something than standing still, waiting for it to arrive." Caleb Rowan did something then that she hadn't seen him do before and wouldn't forget. He smiled. Not much. Just enough a brief, genuine thing gone almost before it was there. But it was real, and it changed his face completely, and something in her chest did something complicated that she noted and decided to think about later. "Then let's move," he said. They rode hard through the middle of the day. By the time the sun had moved past its peak and was beginning its long angle toward afternoon, they were out of the high country and into the lower approach to the valley that held Crestfield. The land office was on the north end of the main street. She'd been there once years ago, with her father, when he'd filed the original registration. She remembered the way the clerk had looked at her father over his spectacles, and then stamped the documents anyway, because the documents were in order, and law in those moments was simply law. She hoped Monday's replacement clerk had the same relationship with the law. They entered Crestfield from the north, which meant the land office was the first substantial building they reached. Caleb tied the horses. Mary took the satchel. The replacement clerk was a young man named Abbott, who had the harried look of someone filling in for someone else and trying to do it correctly. He looked up when they came in, looked at the satchel, and straightened immediately. "I need to file a land title claim," Mary said, setting the satchel on his counter. "On behalf of the Ellison estate. The original registration is in this parcel." She opened the satchel and laid the documents out in order the way her father had taught her registration. First survey, second boundary descriptions, third timestamps last. I also have reason to believe a fraudulent transfer may be attempted on this parcel. I want that on record as well." Abbott looked at the documents. He looked at her. He looked at Caleb, who was standing slightly behind her to the left, and then very carefully looked back at the documents. The original filing was by... Abbott checked the first page. Thomas Ellison, in 1869. "My father," Mary said. "He's deceased. The estate passes to his issue. I'm his daughter and the surviving member of the estate." She had a document for this too, the death certificate filed in Duskwater County Court, with her name listed as surviving next of kin. She laid it on top of the pile. Abbott looked through the papers slowly. Then he looked up. "You said fraudulent transfer. I have reason to believe that someone may attempt to file documents purporting to show a transfer of this parcel that I did not authorize. I want a notation in the record that any such filing should be flagged for investigation, and that I am the legal heir and have not authorized any transfer." Abbott was quiet for a moment. He was young, but he was careful, and Mary could see him turning the situation over, weighing what she was asking against what it might cost him. Caleb stepped forward. He did it quietly, just one step, but it changed the gravity of the room. "Son," he said, and his voice was not threatening. Just certain, the way a mountain is certain. "This woman's father built that land from nothing, registered it properly, and died protecting it. What she's asking you to do is your job. The correct part of your job." He held the young man's gaze. "Is there any part of what she's shown you that isn't in order?" Abbott swallowed. "No, sir," he said. "Then let's get it done." Abbott got it done. It took 40 minutes, the proper stamping, the notarization, the entry into the register, the fraud alert notation that went into a separate ledger that Abbott explained with some pride was kept under lock, separate from the main files. When it was finished, Mary had a stamped receipt with the territorial seal, and Abbott had a ledger entry that would require a judge's order to remove. She stood at that counter and looked at the stamped receipt for a long moment. Her father's name was on it. Thomas Ellison, original registrant, and below it in Abbott's careful hand, Mary Grace Ellison, heir of record filing, confirmed. "Thank you," she said to Abbott. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She turned. Caleb was waiting by the door watching her face. She tucked the receipt into the satchel and walked toward him. When she reached him, she stopped, and without planning to, without particularly deciding to, she said, "My father would have liked you." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face, deeper than the usual small shifts. Something that reached further. "That means something," he said. "I meant it to," she said. They walked outside into the afternoon. They were 2 hours out of Crestfield when they heard the riders behind them. Not the careful parallel movement from this morning. This was direct. Hard-riding pursuit making no effort at subtlety. Mary heard it and looked at Caleb. "They know," she said. "Varnell had someone watching the land office," he said. He was already scanning ahead, reading the terrain, running the same fast calculations she'd seen him run before. "The filing's done. They can't undo it." He looked at her. "But that means they have nothing left to lose by stopping us before we get back." "If we don't make it back?" "The filing stands regardless," he said. "Abbott has it in the ledger. It's done." He looked at her directly. "But I intend for us to make it back." The sound of hooves was closer. "How many?" she asked. "More than this morning," he said. "We can't outrun them on the main trail." He looked up at the ridge to the east. "But they don't know this country. I do." "Then lead," she said. He led. What followed was 2 hours that Mary would remember for the rest of her life, not because of what happened, but because of what she felt during it. The absolute requirement of the present moment. The way fear becomes something else entirely when there is no room for anything except the next decision, the next footfall, the next direction change. She rode where Caleb rode. Turned when he turned, trusted his reading of the land completely, and somewhere in the middle of it, she realized that she wasn't just following him out of necessity. She trusted him. Not the careful conditional trust she'd been managing since the saloon. The real kind. The kind that is also terrifying in its own way because it requires surrender, and surrender has always cost her something before. They lost the riders in a rock canyon that ran north for 3 miles before opening onto the approach to the high trail. The sound of pursuit fell away gradually, then went silent. Caleb pulled Atlas up and listened. Silence. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he exhaled, not dramatically, just the quiet release of a man who has been holding something and can now set it down. "We're clear," he said. Mary was breathing hard. She felt Clara trembling slightly beneath her, the good trembling of a horse that has run hard and needs to stop. She stroked the mare's neck. "You knew that canyon," she said. "I've run cattle through it," he said. "Twice. Years ago. You've been planning routes up here since you arrived, haven't you?" He looked at her. A man who lives alone in remote country either knows his exits or he doesn't live there long. "Is that the only reason?" she asked. He held her gaze. "No," he said after a moment. "I reckon it's not." She didn't ask him to say more. She'd learned over these weeks that Caleb Rowan said exactly what he meant and left the rest for later. There was always a later. She was beginning to believe in that later. They rode back toward the mountain in the long golden hours of late afternoon, and neither of them talked much. But the silence between them now was the kind that has been earned layered and warm and full of things that didn't need saying, because they were already understood. When the cabin came into view above them in the evening light, Mary felt something she hadn't felt in so long, she'd almost forgotten what to call it. Safe. Not because the threat was gone. Varnell was still out there. His men were regrouping somewhere on a trail, reporting back, planning next moves. The filing would hold in a court, but getting to a court required time and survival, and Silas Varnell was not a man who accepted setbacks quietly. She felt safe because of the man riding beside her. Because of what she'd watched him do today. Not the riding, not the navigating, not the guns at his hip that he hadn't needed to draw. The way he'd stepped up to that counter and said, "Son, this is your job." The way he'd looked at her when she said her father would have liked him, and let himself feel it. The broken ones were always harder to trust. But when they gave you their word, they meant it down to the bone. They reached the cabin and dismounted, and Caleb took both horses to the lean-to without being asked the way he always did. Mary went inside and built up the fire the way she always did now. When he came back in, she had food warming and coffee on, and the receipt from the land office open on the table in the lamplight. He sat down across from her and looked at it. "Tomorrow it starts," she said. "He'll make his move." "Yes," Caleb said. "Are you ready for what that looks like?" He looked at her across the table, across the lamp, across the stamped paper, with her father's name, and her name, and the territorial seal that said, "This land is hers, this is true, this is legal, this stands." "I've been ready for something like this for 3 years," he said quietly. "I just needed to know what I was being ready for." Mary looked at him. Outside the cabin, the mountain summer night came down around them, vast and dark and full of what was coming. And inside, 2 people sat with food and coffee and a piece of paper that was worth more than either of them, and they were, for this moment, exactly where they were supposed to be. She reached across the table and turned the receipt face down. "Eat first," she said. "We plan after." He looked at the turned-over paper, then at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he meant it like a promise. They made their plan that night over a table that had seen 2 weeks of cautious meals and careful conversation, and what emerged from it was not elegant, but it was honest. The kind of plan that 2 intelligent people arrive at when they stop pretending the situation is anything other than what it is. Varnell would move within days. They both knew it. The filing was done and legal and stamped with the territorial seal, and that meant Varnell's play had shifted from prevention to destruction. A man like Silas Varnell, who had built everything he had on the assumption that money moved faster than law, did not absorb a legal setback quietly. He absorbed it by changing the game. He can't undo the filing. Mary set her hands flat on the table. But he can make it impossible to pursue. If there's no one left to press the claim in court, then the parcel sits in legal limbo until someone else moves on it, Caleb said, and Varnell has the money to wait longer than any probate court. So the threat isn't the documents anymore. No, Caleb said. The threat is us. She held that for a moment. Then she said, I won't run. He looked at her. I know. I mean it. I'm not leaving this mountain. I'm not starting over somewhere else with nothing looking over my shoulder. I did that in Duskwater for 2 years, and it wore me down to something I didn't like being. She met his eyes. This is where it ends, one way or another. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands, the surgeon's hands scarred and still, and capable of things in both directions. Then we make it end right, he said. Can we get word to the territorial marshal? Takes time, he said. A week minimum to get a rider to the marshal's office in Denverford and another week back if he moves fast. Varnell won't give us 2 weeks. Tibbs, Mary said suddenly. Tibbs knows people. He's been in this county 30 years. He knows the circuit judge. He knows the deputy marshal in Harrow Creek. If he can move. Pete got back to him 2 days ago if he rode clean, Caleb said, following the thread. Tibbs knew we were heading to Crestfield. If he's watching, he knows we made it back. He stood up, walked to the window, stood with his back to her for a moment. I can get a message to Tibbs by tomorrow night if I leave at first light and take the east cut. That's Varnell's side of the mountain, Mary said immediately. I know. Caleb, I know, he said again, turning. But Tibbs is the only person in this county who can get legitimate law moving fast enough to matter. And I'm the only one here who knows that east cut well enough to use it safely. He looked at her steadily. You stay here. Doors barred the rifle. I showed you the revolver in the kitchen drawer. You don't open for anyone you don't recognize, and you don't light the lamp after dark. She stood up. I don't like this. Neither do I. He held her gaze. But I need you here, because if something goes wrong out there, you're the one who knows where Abbott's receipt is and what to do with it. You're the one Tibbs will look for. You're the last line. He paused. Do you understand what I'm saying? She understood. She didn't like it, but she understood, and she was too honest to pretend otherwise. Come back, she said. It came out more plainly than she intended. Something crossed his face. He didn't look away. That's my intention, he said. She nodded once sharp, the way she'd learned to nod when she was closing something before it could cost her more than she could spend. He left before the sky had any color in it. The cabin without Caleb in it was a different place. Mary discovered this within the first hour. It was not that she was helpless. She was not, had never been refused to be. It was that she had grown accustomed to the particular quality of him being there. The sound of his movements in the morning. The coffee on the stove. The way the cabin seemed to brace itself when he was in it, like a structure with a keystone. She kept herself busy. She checked the perimeter the way he'd shown her, walking the cabin's exterior, looking for sign of visitors, watching the trail approaches from the points he'd identified. She worked in the garden for an hour, in the early cool. She went over the documents again, the receipt, the copies, organizing everything in the satchel, in the order a court would want it. Then she sat down at the table and let herself feel the weight of the last 2 weeks. It arrived like weather. The day in the saloon, the crate under her feet, the way Jeb had not met her eyes even once during the whole proceeding. The 2 days of riding up the mountain with a man she didn't know, choosing to trust him, because the alternative was worse, and because something in the way he moved told her he was worth the risk. The east wall, the garden, the coffee that was just there every morning without comment or expectation. She put her head in her hands and allowed herself 3 minutes of the grief she hadn't had room for since this started. Then she lifted her head, straightened her back, and went to check the trail again. He was back before dark. She heard Atlas on the lower trail and was at the door before he'd reached the hitching post, and she felt the particular relief of seeing someone return that you've been afraid might not. Tibbs got the message. he said, coming inside, pulling off his coat. He's moving. He has a connection with the deputy marshal, a man named Carver, who owes him a favor from something years back. Tibbs says Carver's honest, and he'll move if Tibbs asks him right. He sat down heavily. Carver can be here in 3 days if he rides. 3 days, Mary said. I know. Varnell's men could come before that. Yes. He looked at her. So we have 3 days to hold. She nodded. She was already thinking. We can make this cabin harder to approach. There's only one practical trail from below. I've got a system, he said. Trip lines. Signal markers. I set some of them when I first came up here, Habit. We add to them tomorrow. He looked at her with something careful in his expression. Did anything happen while I was gone? No, she said. Then, because she'd spent the day being honest with herself, I was frightened. He held very still. Not of being alone, she said. Of you not coming back. She met his eyes directly the way she'd always met things, straight on, chin up. I wanted you to know that. Because I think pretending otherwise wastes time, and I've wasted enough time. Caleb looked at her for a long, still moment. The lamp was between them, and the light was doing something to his face that made him look less armored than usual, less like a man who had decided not to need anything. Mary, he said, and her name in his voice was different from how anyone else had ever said it, careful, like something worth being careful with. You don't have to say anything back, she said quickly. I'm not asking you to, I was frightened too, he said. Coming back up that east cut, not of Varnell's men. He stopped. Of what I'd find when I got here. She held her breath. I don't do this well, he said. And there was something almost painful in his honesty, the kind of admission a man makes when he's decided to stop protecting himself from a particular truth. Caring about someone. Worrying about someone. I stopped doing it because it seemed like the safer thing. He looked at his hands. It's not as it turns out. It's just the lonelier thing. Mary looked at him across the lamp, across the table, across every careful mile they'd put between themselves and the worst versions of who they'd been before this. We don't have to name it, she said quietly. Not tonight. No, he agreed. But we're not pretending it's not there. No, he said again. We're not doing that either. It was enough. More than enough. She reached across the table and set her hand flat next to his, not touching, just close, and he looked at her hand and then at her face, and for a moment, the whole situation. Varnell, the filing, the 3-day wait. The men somewhere on the mountain. All of it receded, and there were just 2 people sitting at a table deciding not to be alone anymore. Then he turned his hand over, and she set hers in it. They sat like that for a while, and neither of them spoke, and the fire burned down in the stove, and outside the mountain held them in its enormous, indifferent dark. The first sign came at dawn on the 2nd day. Caleb was outside checking the trip lines when he found the first one triggered a simple arrangement of fishing line and a small bell he'd strung between 2 pines on the south approach. The line was broken. The bell was on the ground. He came back to the cabin moving fast. Someone came up the south approach last night, he said. Didn't get far, the secondary line is still intact, so they stopped or turned back. But they were here. Mary felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with temperature. Testing us, she said. Seeing what we have, what our range of awareness is. He was already at the locked cabinet, the one she'd noticed on the first day and never asked about directly. He opened it now without hesitation, and inside were what she'd suspected medical supplies organized with precision, and beside them, ammunition, and a second rifle older than the first, but well maintained. He loaded both rifles and set them at the 2 windows that faced south. What do we do? She asked. We wait, he said, and we don't give them a reason to come fast. He looked at her. Stay back from the windows. Move normally inside. We don't want them to know we found the trip line. You want them to think we're not expecting them. I want them to come slow, he said. Slow gives Carver time. She understood. And if Carver doesn't come in time, He handed her the revolver from the kitchen drawer. The one he'd shown her on the first day, walked her through loading and firing with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who didn't assume incompetence. "You know how to use it," he said. "I know how to use it," she confirmed. He looked at her for a moment. "I want you to understand something," he said. "Whatever happens in the next day or two, the filing is done. The record exists. Tibbs knows, Abbott knows, Carver knows we filed. Even if Varnell, even in the worst case, the land is protected." "I know that," she said. "I need you to know it down in your bones," he said, "because I need you to be able to make decisions that aren't about the land, just about surviving." Mary looked at him. She read his face, the soldier in him now fully present, the part that had worked in field tents with the noise outside and a man bleeding on the table. The part that went completely there. "I understand," she said. He nodded. Then he went to the south window and watched. The second day passed in a state of contained readiness that was its own kind of exhausting. Every sound evaluated. Every shift of light through the trees interpreted. They traded positions at the windows every 2 hours, ate without leaving the cabin, spoke in low voices, even though there was no rational reason to keep their voices down inside 4 walls. In the afternoon, Mary said, "Tell me something from before. Not the war, something good." He was at the north window scanning the tree line. He didn't look away from it. "My wife used to make a particular kind of apple pie," he said. "She'd burn the edges deliberately, said the slightly burned part was the best part." "Was she right?" A pause. "Yeah," he said, and there was a smile somewhere in the word, buried deep but real. "She was?" "What was her name?" "Clara," he said. Mary went very still. "The mare," she said. He turned from the window, then just slightly. "You named her that," he said. "I noticed." "I named her before I knew." "I know," he said. "I know you did." He looked at her. "I didn't mind. It felt like something." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "She was a good woman, I think." "The best I knew," he said simply, and turned back to the window. They held the silence together, and it was the most intimate thing they'd shared yet. Sitting with someone else's grief like it was yours to hold for a while, just to give them a rest from carrying it. Mid-morning of the third day, everything changed. Caleb was outside. He'd gone to check the north trip lines, a 10-minute circuit he'd done twice a day since they found the broken one when Mary heard horses. Not from the south, from the east. She went to the east window and saw 3 riders coming down through the upper tree line, moving with speed and confidence, and the particular posture of men who do not intend to knock. She grabbed the rifle and went to the door. "Caleb," she called loud and clear. "No point in quiet now." She heard him running before she finished the word. He came around the north corner of the cabin at a dead run, read the east approach in one glance, and reached her in 3 strides. He took the door and she took the east window, and neither of them spoke, because they'd run out of time for speaking. The 3 riders came into the clearing and stopped. The one in front was a man Mary had never seen before. Big, gray-bearded, dressed in the kind of clothes that said money handled by someone else. He sat his horse like a man who owns the ground it's standing on. "Rowan," the man called. "Caleb Rowan, step out." Caleb opened the door and stepped onto the porch. He had the rifle. He hadn't raised it, but he had it. "I'm Rowan," he said. "My name is Galt," the man said. "I work for Silas Varnell." "I know who you are," Caleb said. "You threatened a dying man to sign over his land, Thomas Ellison." Something moved across Galt's face. "Mr. Varnell wants to offer a resolution." "Does he?" "The woman signs a transfer document. You're paid for your trouble generously, and everyone walks away from this mountain." Galt spread his hands, the gesture of a reasonable man. "Nobody needs to get hurt." "The filing's done," Caleb said. "In Crestfield, territorial record. You know that already." "A filing can be contested," Galt said. "Filings get lost. Records get misplaced. Mr. Varnell has the resources and the patience to contest this for 20 years if necessary. He paused. The woman would be an old woman by the time it resolved. Or, Caleb said, she takes it to a federal court in 6 months with Tibbs's testimony and the original documents and a receipt from Abbott at the Crestfield Land Office, and Varnell spends those 20 years in Canyon City. Galt's expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. He hadn't known about Tibbs, or Abbott specifically, or the federal angle. The calculation was happening behind his eyes, and Caleb was watching it happen. "Step away from this, Rowan," Galt said, and the reasonable tone was gone now. "This isn't your fight." "She made it mine," Caleb said. "About 3 weeks ago in a saloon in Duskwater. You were going to want to remember that part." Then the cabin door opened behind him. Mary stepped out onto the porch. She had the revolver in her right hand held down, but visible, and she stood beside Caleb in the summer morning with her chin up exactly the way she'd stood on that crate in the saloon and looked at every man in the room. "Mr. Galt," she said, and her voice was completely steady. "I want you to go back to Silas Varnell and tell him exactly what you saw here. Tell him I'm standing on my family's land with my family's documents filed in the territorial record with the names of 3 witnesses who will testify to their authenticity. Tell him I'm not signing anything. Tell him I'm not leaving." She paused. "And tell him the deputy marshal is 2 hours behind you on the Eastern Trail." Galt stared at her. "She's bluffing," one of the riders behind him said. "Am I?" Mary said. She wasn't. She had no way of knowing exactly where Carver was, but she held Galt's eyes with a certainty that had nothing to do with bluffing, and everything to do with a woman who had made her decision 3 weeks ago in a saloon and had not changed her mind since. Galt looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him with the flat, burned steel patience of a man who has nothing left to lose and has recently remembered what he's got to keep. The riders behind Galt exchanged a look. Galt pulled his horse around. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," Caleb said, "but today it is." They watched the 3 riders go back up through the eastern trees. The sound of hooves faded. The clearing was quiet. Mary let out a breath that she had been holding since she stepped onto the porch. Her hand, she noticed, was shaking slightly, not from fear, she thought, but from the particular release of held tension, the body's honest accounting after the moment has passed. Caleb turned and looked at her. "Deputy Marshal," he said. "I estimated," she said. Something like a laugh moved through him, not quite arriving but close. "You estimated. I've been estimating my way through this entire situation," she said. "I've done all right so far." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was doing things she didn't let herself think about too carefully, and he was looking at her the way he had the night she'd put her hand near his at the table, like something he hadn't planned to want and had stopped arguing with. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You have." And then, because neither of them had slept well in 2 days, and the adrenaline was passing, and the mountain was quiet, and it was for this exact moment over, she sat down on the porch step and put her face in her hands and laughed the slightly unhinged laugh of pure relief. And after a moment, he sat down beside her close enough that their arms touched, and she felt the warmth of him and didn't move away. They sat like that until her laughter settled. "Caleb," she said, face still in her hands. "Yeah. I'm very tired." "I know," he said. "I think I've been tired for about 2 years." "Yeah," he said again softer. "I think you have." She lifted her head, looked at the clearing where Galt's horses had been, looked at the mountain green and enormous and indifferent to all of it. Then she looked at him. "When Carver gets here," she started. "When Carver gets here, it moves into law's hands," he said. "That's what the law is for." He met her eyes. "And then we figure out what's next." "We," she said, noting the word. "We," he said, not flinching from it. She nodded slowly, turned back to the mountain. Let the word settle in the place where the exhaustion lived. "We." It was the most significant thing either of them had said in 3 weeks, and they both knew it, And neither of them made more of it than it was, because they were both people who understood that some things needed room to breathe before you named them. Carver arrived 4 hours later. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a deputy marshal's badge and Tibbs' letter in his breast pocket, and the look of a man who had ridden hard and wanted answers before he did anything else. He pulled up at the cabin, looked at Caleb on the porch, and said, "Rowan." "That's right," Caleb said. "Tibbs says you need law." "Tibbs is correct." Carver looked at Mary. "You're Mary Ellison." "I am," she said. "You filed in Crestfield 4 days ago, stamped and entered. Abbott can confirm." Carver nodded slowly, working through his information. "I've got a warrant for Silas Varnell," he said, and the words hit the air like something solid. "Judge Aldrin signed it this morning in Harrow Creek based on Tibbs's affidavit and a complaint from the Crestfield filing clerk about intimidation of a territorial officer." He looked at them. "Varnell doesn't know about the warrant yet." Mary went very still. "Tibbs testified already." "Bruises and all," Carver said, and there was a grim satisfaction in it. "Old man's stubborn when he wants to be." Caleb looked at Mary. She was looking at the warrant in Carver's hand, a piece of paper, like the other piece of paper, small and official, and worth more than everything Varnell had tried to throw at them. "Galt was here this morning," Caleb said, "with 2 men. They left when Mary told them you were coming." Carver's eyebrows went up. "She told them I was coming." "I estimated your arrival," Mary said. Carver looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "I'm going to need everything you've got," he said. "Documents, the receipt from Abbott, anything you have on Galt and the riders, the approach this morning, all of it." "Come inside," Mary said. "I'll put coffee on." They talked with Carver for 2 hours. He was thorough and methodical and honest in the way that law in its best incarnation is supposed to be, not exciting, not dramatic, just careful and implacable. He wrote down everything, asked questions that showed he was genuinely listening, and when they were done, he folded his notes and told them what came next. "I'll take 2 deputies up the north face tonight, and we'll move on Varnell's operation tomorrow at first light," he said. "Galt and the men who were here this morning are part of the warrant accessory to intimidation, at minimum possibly more once we get into Varnell's books." He looked at them. "I'd like you both to stay on this mountain for the next week. You're the primary witnesses. I'll need you available." "We're not going anywhere," Caleb said. Carver nodded. He put his hat on and stood to leave, then paused at the door. He looked at Mary. "Your father registered that parcel right," he said. 14 years and it still held. That's not nothing." Mary swallowed. "No," she said. "It's not." Carver left. The cabin was quiet. Mary stood in the middle of the room and didn't move for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Carver's horse moving away toward the north trail. The sound of law going to do its work. The sound of something she'd been holding up for 2 years, finally being held by someone else. She felt Caleb before she heard him, his presence shifting something in the air of the room the way it always did. "Hey," he said from close behind her. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, open in a way that she understood cost him the face of a man who had decided that the wall he'd been living behind was less useful than what was on the other side of it. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I need a minute to find out." "Take it," he said. She looked at him. "Stay nearby," she said. "Yes," he said. "I will." She went and sat in the chair by the window, the one that looked out at the mountain, and she looked at the mountain and she thought about her father's hands stamping that original registration. She thought about Tibbs's bruises. She thought about a boy named Pete riding through wilderness with news. She thought about Abbott and his careful handwriting. She thought about a man who had walked into a saloon and set a bag of gold on a table without saying a word. She was not all right yet. She would be. She was the daughter of a woman who had grown a garden in Vermont mountain soil, and a man who had registered 40 acres and died holding the title, and she had not come this far to be anything less than all right. But she needed the minute. Caleb gave it to her. He sat at the table behind her close enough to hear far enough to give her room, and he was quiet in the particular way he was quiet, when the silence was something he was offering on purpose. When she finally turned back around, he was looking at his hands. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. From the beginning." His jaw moved slightly, the muscle working the way it did when something reached him that he hadn't prepared for. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "I know I don't owe it," she said. "I'm giving it. There's a difference." He held her gaze. "Yeah," he said softly. "There is." Outside, the mountain turned through its long summer afternoon green and enormous, and for now quiet. And inside the cabin, two people who had arrived at each other by the worst possible road sat with the fact that the worst was passing, and tried carefully and honestly to figure out what that meant. It meant they were still here. It meant the land was safe. It meant the coffee was cold, and neither of them cared, and the lamp needed lighting, and there was food to make, and tomorrow there was still work to do, and the day after that, and the day after that, and all of it stretched ahead like country. You've been afraid to cross, and suddenly have permission to walk into. That was enough. For now, that was everything. Carver arrested Silas Varnell at first light on a Tuesday. Mary and Caleb heard about it from Pete, who rode up the mountain 2 days later with the particular energy of a boy who has been waiting his whole life to deliver good news and finally has some. Varnell had been in his office at the mine operation when Carver and 2 deputies arrived with the warrant. He'd tried to send for his lawyer and then tried to send for Galt. And then, when neither of those things worked, he'd tried to simply refuse standing behind his desk with the specific outrage of a man who had never in his adult life been told no by anyone with a badge. Carver had told him no anyway. Galt had been picked up on the Eastern Trail an hour later, and the 2 riders from the cabin confrontation were in custody in Harrow Creek by evening. Tibbs was at the jailhouse when they brought Varnell in, Pete said, sitting at the cabin table eating cornbread with the appetite of the young. Said Varnell looked at him and said, "You did this." And Tibbs said, "Thomas Ellison did this 14 years ago when he filed proper." Pete shook his head with satisfaction. Tibbs said it real quiet, said it was the best thing he'd ever said in his life. Mary put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Caleb watched her from across the table, watched the way the news moved through her, not the explosive relief she might have felt a week ago, but something slower and deeper, the particular unwinding of attention that has been held so long, the body doesn't quite know what to do without it. "Is it over?" she asked Carver's deputy, a young man named Reyes, who had ridden up with Pete to deliver the official information. Reyes chose his words carefully. "Varnell's in custody. The warrant covers fraud intimidation of a territorial officer and 3 counts related to the land claims. Judge Aldrins set a hearing for 4 weeks out." He paused. "His lawyers are going to fight it. Men like Varnell always fight. But the filing's in the record, the witnesses are solid, and Tibbs's testimony about Galt threatening your father." He stopped. "That part's strong, Miss Ellison. That part's very strong." 4 weeks, she said. "At minimum," Reyes said. "Could be 6 months before it fully resolves in court. But—" he looked at her directly. "He's not coming up this mountain again. I can promise you that much." After Pete and Reyes left, Mary and Caleb sat with the news the way you sit with anything large, giving it room, letting it take the shape it was going to take. "It's not over," she said finally. "No," Caleb agreed, "but the worst of it is. The hearing. You'll have Carver and Reyes and Tibbs and Abbott and every document your father ever touched," Caleb said. "You'll have me if you need me. You're not walking into that hearing alone." She looked at him. "You'd go to Harrow Creek. Testify." "I was in that saloon," he said simply. "I know what Jeb said, and what Varnell's man said afterward. That's testimony." He held her gaze. "I'm not leaving you to carry this alone." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You know, 2 months ago I couldn't have told you what it felt like to have someone say that. Neither could I, he said. They looked at each other across the table that had become the center of their shared world, where they'd planned and eaten and argued quietly and sat in silence, and once on a night 3 weeks ago held hands without saying what it meant. There's something I need to tell you, Mary said. Something in her voice changed, just slightly, just enough that Caleb heard it immediately and went still. All right, he said. She looked at her hands, looked at him, looked at her hands again. The telling of it required something, and she was gathering that something with the visible effort of a person who has rehearsed a moment many times and still finds the actual moment harder than the rehearsal. I think I'm expecting a child, she said. The cabin went completely silent. Caleb did not move. His expression did not collapse or shatter, or do any of the dramatic things that expressions do in stories when men receive unexpected news. He simply went very still, the stillness of a man absorbing something that is going to rearrange everything and taking the time to let the rearranging happen properly. Before the saloon, she said, her voice carefully steady. Before Duskwater. I didn't know for certain until last week, but I'd suspected for longer. There was a man in Duskwater who it wasn't. She stopped, steadied herself, started again. It wasn't my choice, and I didn't know when I didn't know when any of this started. I found out here on this mountain, and I've been trying to find the right moment to tell you, and there hasn't been a right moment because every moment has had something else in it. Caleb looked at her. He had not looked away once during the whole of what she'd said. Are you all right? He asked. First thing. The very first thing. Something broke open slightly in her chest. Physically, yes, she said. It's early. I've been careful. I know what to watch for. She paused. I don't know how to feel about the rest of it. I've been trying to work that out. You don't have to have it worked out, he said. Caleb, Mary. His voice was quiet and absolute. You don't have to have it worked out. Not tonight. Not alone. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. Is this why you were so careful when you talked about what came next? What you'd do after the hearing? She met his eyes. I didn't know how to tell you in a way that was fair. You took me in as you made a promise, and I was holding this back, and I didn't want you to feel... Stop, he said gently. She stopped. I need you to hear something, he said, and his voice was the voice he used when he meant everything he was about to say down to the last syllable. What you just told me does not change a single thing about the promise I made you in that saloon. Not one thing. He held her gaze. What it changes is what I need to ask you. She waited. Will you let me stay? He said. Not because you need me to, because I want to. The question landed in the silence between them and sat there solid and genuine, with none of the complicated maneuvering of people who mean something different from what they say. Mary Ellison, who had been holding herself together by will and stubbornness, and the particular resilience of a woman who had never been given the luxury of falling apart, felt something in her eyes that she had not let happen in a very long time. She did not fall apart, but she allowed herself just this once to be seen by someone. Yes, she said. I'll let you stay. He exhaled just that, just the breath going out of him like the last of something he'd been bracing against. Good, he said. The weeks that followed were the quietest they'd had since she'd arrived. Not empty. The mountain was never empty, and there was always work. And Caleb threw himself into the preparation for winter with the particular focus of a man who is building something for more than one person and knows it. He expanded the storage room without asking for her help this time. She noticed this and understood it for what it was. Not exclusion, but protection. The instinct of a man recalibrating around what needed to be kept safe. She let him do it. She was busy with her own recalibration. She wrote letters. 3 of them to Carver, to Tibbs, and to Abbott, laying out her plan for the hearing in Harrow Creek, requesting specific documents asking Tibbs to identify 2 additional witnesses from the mining community who had seen Varnell's operation cross the boundary line. Caleb read them over when she asked and made 2 suggestions that improved them and kept his hands off the rest because he understood they were hers. They moved around each other in the cabin with the ease of people who have learned the physical language of shared space, who moves first in the morning, who takes which side of the work table, whose coffee gets poured without asking. Small things that accumulate into something large before either person notices it's happened. One evening, she was reading at the table and looked up to find him watching her from across the room with an expression she'd started to recognize, the open one, the one that cost him the one he was getting gradually better at not hiding. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Caleb." He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "I was thinking about a thing Reyes said. When they brought Varnell in." He paused. "He said Tibbs told Varnell that Thomas Ellison did this 14 years ago when he filed proper." "Yes," Mary said. "Your father built something that protected you from a man he never met," Caleb said. "From the grave, through paperwork and a tin box under the floorboards." He paused. "That's the kind of thing that takes a long time to appreciate fully." Mary set her book down. "I think about him every day," she said. "I know," Caleb said. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, and then carefully he said, "I'd like to know more about him, if you're willing to tell it." She looked at him. This man who had lost his own and chosen a mountain, and then chosen something else. He was stubborn, she said, and funny in the quiet way where you didn't always know he was joking until it was over. He could fix anything with the wrong tools. He was a terrible cook, but he always tried. She paused. "He called me his best investment. Not like the word Jeb used, he meant it like the thing he was most proud of putting his whole self into." Caleb listened with his full attention the way he did everything. "He would have argued with you," she said. "About medicine, about what you owe people with the skills you have." Caleb smiled, the real one, the brief one. "I know," he said. "He'd have been right," she said. "I know that too," he said. He looked at his hands. "I've been thinking about it, the medicine, whether I was punishing the right person by stopping." She waited. "I don't think I was," he said quietly. It was a small sentence carrying enormous weight. She understood what it cost him. She didn't minimize it by responding too quickly. "There's no doctor within 40 miles of this mountain," she said finally carefully. "No," he said. "There isn't." She let that sit where it was. Let him sit with it. He didn't need to be pushed. He'd gotten to this on his own, which was the only way it would hold. Yeah. The hearing date arrived with a letter from Carver, not moved, not delayed, confirmed for the 3rd week of September. 2 days before they were due to ride down to Harrow Creek, Caleb came inside from the morning circuit and stopped in the doorway. Mary was at the table. She had both hands flat on the surface and her face was wrong, not sick, not frightened, but the particular careful blankness of a person managing physical discomfort by sheer concentration. "What is it?" he said immediately. "It's all right," she said. "Mary. I've been having some cramping, since this morning." She looked up at him. "It's probably nothing. I know the signs of something serious, and this isn't—" He was already at the cabinet. "How long since this morning?" 3 hours. It comes and goes." She watched him. "Caleb, I know what I'm doing." "So do I," he said, not looking at her, pulling things from the cabinet. "What's the pain level?" 4, maybe 4.5. She watched him move. "You're practicing medicine right now." He stopped, turned to look at her. The set of his face was professional in a way she'd never seen from him. Not the careful, closed expression of a man controlling himself, but the focused presence of a surgeon. Completely there. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." He brought what he needed to the table and sat across from her. "Talk to me. Everything since this morning. Start at the beginning." She talked. He listened and asked precise questions, and she answered with the vocabulary of a woman raised in a medical household, which meant they could communicate efficiently and honestly. He examined what he could examine appropriately and carefully, and when he was done he sat back and looked at her with the expression of a man who has assessed a situation and arrived at a position he can defend. "It's not a crisis," he said, "but I want you still today. No riding. The hearing is in 2 days. Today you rest." His voice was firm in the way that was not harsh, just certain. "I'll send word to Carver to confirm we're still coming. We are still coming." He met her eyes. "But today you let your body do what it's trying to do, which is protect something." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're good at this," she said. He looked away briefly. Something moved in his face. "I remember how to be," he said quietly. "You never stopped," she said. "The cabinet, the books, the herbs." "In case," he said, which was what he'd said on the first day. The word meant something different now. She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said, "for coming back to it." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Thank her when she's born." Mary stared at him. He was looking at the window, at the mountain through it, at something she couldn't see. "Her," Mary said softly. "Just a thought," he said. She felt something shift in her chest, deep and warm, and so unexpected, it took her a moment to recognize it as the specific feeling of a future becoming real. She rested. He stayed close, not hovering, just present, the way he was present, which was the most complete presence she'd ever known. They rode to Harrow Creek on the third day, arriving in the late morning to find Tibbs already there, sitting outside the courthouse, with the patient permanence of a man who has been waiting his whole life for this particular day, and arrived early to be sure. He stood when he saw Mary, and she crossed the distance between them quickly, and he held her by both arms, and looked at her face and said, "Your father would be, he would be so." And then his voice failed him, and she held his weathered old hands in both of hers and said, "I know, me too." Caleb stood back and let them have it. Reyes met them at the courthouse door, with the procedural briefing. Judge Aldrin, 2 hours Varnell's lawyers had filed 2 pre-hearing motions that Carver's people had already answered. They went inside. The courtroom was small and full, and smelled of wood and old paper. Varnell was there at the opposing table, in better clothes than the mine office, with 2 lawyers on either side of him like buttresses. He looked at Mary when she came in, and something moved in his face. Not remorse, not even fear exactly. The particular expression of a powerful man who is for the first time in a room where his power doesn't transfer. Mary looked back at him. She did not look away first. Caleb sat beside her at the table. He was not a lawyer and had no official role until Carver called him as a witness, which was scheduled for the afternoon session. But he was there, solid and present, and she felt it the way she always felt his presence, as something structural. Tibbs sat on her other side. Judge Aldrin came in, and the room stood and then sat, and the proceeding began. It was not dramatic in the way of stories. Law in its actual functioning is thorough and exhausting and often dull in its mechanics. Documents were entered. Dates were confirmed. Abbott testified about the filing, and Varnell's lawyer questioned him for 40 minutes about clerical procedure, and Abbott answered every question with the meticulous accuracy of a man who had kept correct records and knew it. Then Tibbs testified. He was on the stand for an hour. He described Thomas Ellison's original registration. He described the survey work he'd done with Ellison decades back that established the boundary lines. He described the day Galt came to his house and the things Galt said about what the visit would become if he didn't produce the documents. He described his bruises, which Carver's deputy had photographed and entered into evidence. Varnell's lawyers questioned him for another 40 minutes. Tibbs answered everything without moving from his position by a single inch. When he came back to the table, Mary put her hand over his. "Good," she whispered. "Your father taught me to tell the truth and take the consequences," Tibbs said. Seemed like the right day to remember it. In the afternoon session, Caleb testified. He described the saloon in Duskwater. The crate, the rope on Mary's wrists, the words Jeb Collins used and the words Varnell's man had used afterward, asset interest, specific the language of a man who wanted to own a person for what she could be made to sign. He answered questions in the same flat, direct voice he used for everything, and he did not embellish, and he did not hedge, and he did not look at Varnell's table. When Varnell's lawyer tried to suggest that the whole proceeding in the saloon was a private debt matter unrelated to the land claim, Caleb said, "The man Varnell sent to the saloon used the words specific interest in the woman. He said the money was incidental. Those are not the words of a creditor collecting a debt. Those are the words of a man following his employer's specific instructions." He paused. "You can ask the bartender in Duskwater. He heard the same thing." There was a brief commotion at Varnell's table. They had not known about the bartender. Judge Aldrin called for quiet. Carver was already making a note. When Caleb came back to the table, he sat down, and Mary leaned slightly toward him and said quietly, "The bartender." "He was there," Caleb said simply. "He counted the money." "You planned that?" "I thought it might be useful," he said. She looked at him. The closed expression, the burned steel eyes, the absolute composure of a man who had spent the last 3 weeks turning back toward a world he'd left and was discovering piece by piece that the world had things in it worth coming back for. "You are relentless," she said. "When it matters," he said. Judge Aldrin recessed for the day and set the decision hearing for the following week. He did not grant Varnell's motion for dismissal. He did not allow the fraudulent transfer documents which Varnell's lawyers had attempted to enter under a fabricated date into evidence. He looked at those documents over the top of his spectacles and told the courtroom that he would be referring the matter to the territorial attorney's office for a separate investigation. Varnell's jaw tightened. His lawyers leaned together. Mary watched all of it from the plaintiff's table, with the stillness of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this moment, and refuses to waste it on anything but full attention. When the gavel came down for the recess, the room exhaled. Tibbs said, "We got him." Carver said, "We're close. Hold until next week." Mary said nothing. She looked at the bench where Judge Aldrin had been sitting at the empty chair at the place where law had been operating today, the way her father had always believed it was supposed to operate slowly, carefully, without regard for who had the most money. She felt a hand at the small of her back, just the weight of it steady and certain. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. "We should get you back to the mountain," Caleb said close behind her. "You need rest and food, and the horse isn't as comfortable as I'd like for the ride back." "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I want you to stay that way." She turned then, because she wanted to see his face when she said what she was going to say. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her, "I want to stay," she said. "On the mountain. I want to stay there." She held his gaze. "Not because I have nowhere else. Because it's where I want to be." He was very still. "The hearing next week," she started. "We'll come back for it," he said. "And after, when it's settled, we'll figure out what after looks like when we get there," he said. "Together." The word landed the same way we had landed weeks ago at the table, solid and warm and requiring nothing more than what it was. "Together," she said. He touched the brim of his hat, the smallest gesture the Western language for something larger than words. "Let's go home," he said. They walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon. Tibbs walked behind them and watched the way they moved, the slight adjustment of space between two people who have learned each other's rhythms without noticing when it happened, and he smiled the smile of an old man who had known Thomas Ellison for 30 years and thought he recognized something. The horses were at the hitching post. Atlas stood patient, as always. Clara, the mare whose name had chosen itself, lifted her head when Mary put a hand on her neck. Caleb held the stirrup without being asked. She mounted, and they turned north toward the mountain, and behind them, Harrow Creek went about its business, and the courthouse held its records, and somewhere in a cell, a man named Silas Varnell sat with his lawyers, and the dawning understanding that 14 years ago, a man named Thomas Ellison had done one careful, stubborn, proper thing, and it had been enough. They rode in the long afternoon, and the mountain came up to meet them, green and enormous, and full of everything that waited on the other side of everything they'd been through. Mary rode and felt the particular exhaustion of a day that has cost exactly as much as it should, and underneath it something she was only beginning to let herself fully feel. Hope. Clean, uncomplicated, working its way, upward hope. The kind that doesn't ask for guarantees or promises of ease. Just the reasonable assurance that the people you're moving toward are worth moving toward. She looked at Caleb riding beside her. He was looking at the trail ahead with the ease of a man in country he knows, and has decided to keep knowing. He felt her looking and turned his head. For a moment, they just looked at each other riding side by side up the mountain, and everything that hadn't been said, and everything that had, and everything that was still coming, sat between them and around them, and it was somehow all right. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "My father," she said, "and your daughter, and the fact that in some version of the world they never knew they'd be about the same age." Caleb was quiet. "I think they would have liked each other," Mary said. He looked at the trail again. His jaw worked. "Yeah," he said after a moment. His voice was rough at the edges, the way a voice gets when something reaches the part of a person they don't often let things reach. "I think they would have." They rode on. The mountain received them as it always did, without ceremony, without judgment, with the enormous, indifferent welcome of country that doesn't care what you've been through and doesn't need to, because it's big enough to hold all of it. And in its high north face, where the cabin sat solid against the rock, a lamp would need lighting, and wood would need bringing, and there was food to make, and a decision hearing in a week and months of legal process beyond that, and a child growing quietly toward a world that was today slightly less dangerous than it had been yesterday. All of it waited. All of it was worth getting to. The decision hearing came on a Thursday. Judge Aldrin took 40 minutes. 40 minutes to read through everything Carver had built, everything Abbott had filed, everything Tibbs had testified to, everything Caleb had said from the witness stand, about a saloon and a crate, and a man named Galt, who had the specific vocabulary of someone carrying out orders. Mary sat at the plaintiff's table and did not move for those 40 minutes. Caleb sat beside her. Tibbs sat on her other side. Reyes was behind them, and Carver was at the back of the room with his arms folded, and the expression of a man who has done his job and is waiting for the institution he serves to do its. Varnell sat across the room in his good clothes with his two lawyers, and the particular stillness of a man who has finally understood that the room he is in does not care how much he has. Judge Aldrin looked up from his papers. "In the matter of the Ellison land parcel," he said, "this court finds the original registration of 1869 valid, properly executed, and legally binding. The attempts to contest this registration through fraudulent transfer documentation are not only denied, but referred to the territorial attorney for criminal investigation." He paused, and the pause had weight. "The plaintiff, Mary Grace Ellison, is confirmed as legal heir and sole title holder of the parcel as registered. All mining operations conducted on this parcel without authorization are in violation of the Territorial Land Code and must cease within 30 days pending separate proceedings." He set down his papers. "Furthermore," he said, "Mr. Silas Varnell is remanded for trial on charges of fraud, conspiracy to intimidate a territorial officer, and unlawful coercion. Bail is set at $5,000. He looked at Varnell's table with the dry dispassion of a man who has seen every kind of scheme and grown tired of all of them. "In my experience, gentlemen, a man who builds on ground he doesn't own is eventually undone by what's underneath him. Mr. Varnell, you've been building on the Ellison ground for 2 years. I'd call that your first mistake. Thinking you could simply buy or coerce your way past 14 years of proper record, that was your last." The gavel came down. The room moved. Tibbs made a sound beside her, a short, compressed sound that was everything he wasn't going to say out loud in a courtroom. Reyes exhaled. Carver uncrossed his arms. Mary sat very still. She heard the gavel. She heard the room beginning to shift and murmur around her. She felt Caleb's hand come to rest on the table an inch from hers, the same way it had that first night at the cabin, close, but not presuming, offering without demanding. She turned her hand over and put it in his. He held it. "It's done," he said quietly. "It's done," she said. She did not cry. She had used up her tears on smaller things over the past 2 years, the frustrations and the fears and the grinding loneliness of carrying something no one else knew you were carrying. What she felt now was too large for tears. It was the feeling of a weight being set down after so long that the body doesn't immediately know how to stand without it. She sat with it for a moment, felt it, let it be real. Then she stood up because there were things to do and people to thank, and her father's name to carry correctly into the next part of whatever this was going to be. Varnell was led out of the courtroom by a deputy, and as he passed the plaintiff's table, he stopped just for a moment, just long enough, and looked at Mary. She looked back at him. "You should have offered your father a fair price," she said. "He would have listened. He was a reasonable man." Varnell said nothing. Something moved in his face that was complicated and probably not remorse, but was at least the beginning of the understanding that he had miscalculated somewhere fundamental. The deputy moved him along. Galt, already in custody, would be dealt with separately. The 2 riders from the cabin confrontation had already made arrangements with Carver that involved cooperation and reduced charges. The machine of law, once moving, had its own momentum. Outside the courthouse, Tibbs took Mary's hands again, both of them, and looked at her the way he had when she'd arrived, like a man seeing something he'd waited a long time to see. "Thomas would have stood right here," Tibbs said. "Right here on these steps, and he would have looked at this and said, 'I always knew it would hold.'" "He would have," Mary said. "He said it about a lot of things. He was usually right." "He was right about you," Tibbs said. She squeezed the old man's hands and let go before she lost the composure she was managing carefully. Carver shook her hand with the brisk professionalism of a man who respected what she'd done and expressed it in the currency of professional acknowledgement. "You'll need to come back when the mining proceedings start," he said. "Probably 2 months out. We'll need your testimony on the boundary encroachment." "I'll be here," she said. "We'll be here," Caleb said beside her. Carver looked at him. Something passed between them, the recognition of 2 men who had been in difficult country together and come out on the right side. Carver nodded once. Caleb tipped his hat once. That was sufficient. They rode back toward the mountain in the late afternoon, and this time the ride felt different from every other ride they'd made, not urgent, not pursued, not moving toward a deadline, just moving toward home. Mary rode and let herself think about that word. Home. It was a word she'd been careful with since her father's house was lost. Careful the way you're careful with a word that has burned you before holding it at a distance, not letting it attach to anything temporary. The cabin on the north face of the Rockmore Pass was not temporary. She knew that now. It was in the way Caleb had expanded the storage room without being asked. It was in the coffee that was always on the stove. It was in the east wall they'd built together, and the garden that was coming in better than either of them had expected. It was in the unlocked cabinet and the Gray's Anatomy, with the separated binding, and the man who had said, "I remember how to be." She let the word attach. Home. But 3 days after they got back to the mountain, something shifted. Mary woke before dawn and lay still in the dark, and knew the way a woman knows that the next chapter of something was beginning. She had been expecting it, had known for weeks, had been calculating, had made sure Caleb knew what to watch for and when to start watching for it more closely. She was not afraid. She had been raised at the elbow of a woman who brought children into the world in hard places with limited tools, and she knew what to do and what to watch for and what meant something was wrong. She lay still for a while longer, taking stock. Then she got up, moved to the main room, and put wood on the stove. Caleb appeared in the doorway in about 90 seconds, which told her he had not been sleeping soundly either. He looked at her face and asked nothing, because her face told him what he needed to know. "Is it time?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "But today." He nodded the crisp, professional nod she'd seen from him in the courtroom and occasionally at the cabin when he shifted into the focused efficiency of a man who has a task and intends to execute it correctly. "Then we prepare," he said. They prepared. He moved through the cabin doing the things he needed to do with the precision of a surgeon who has rediscovered his tools, laying out what was in the cabinet in the order he would want it. Heating water, checking the bed situation, thinking through contingencies. She watched him move and felt the odd double awareness of a woman managing her own physical experience while simultaneously watching someone she loves operate at the best version of themselves. She had not said that word yet. Not to him, not to herself, not clearly and directly. She said it now inside quietly, just to see how it settled. Loves. It settled like a stone finding the bottom of still water. Natural. Complete. "You're thinking loudly," Caleb said from across the room. "How can you tell?" "Your face does a specific thing," he said. "What thing?" "A good thing," he said, and didn't elaborate, and went back to what he was doing. She held the warmth of that and set it aside for later, because later there would be time, and right now there was work. The labor was long in the way that first labors are long, not dangerous, not wrong, just thorough, the body doing what it was built to do at the pace it intended to do it. Caleb was steady throughout in a way that was neither dramatic nor clinical, but somewhere between the focused calm of a man who has seen worse and is determined, this will not become worse, combined with the particular gentleness of someone who knows the person in front of him. He talked to her. Not constantly, he wasn't the kind to fill silence for its own sake, but at intervals, during the hard parts, when she needed something to hold on to, that wasn't the pain. "Tell me something," she said once during a stretch that required most of her concentration. "My wife burned the pie edges on purpose," he said. She almost laughed. "You told me that already." "She also taught Sunday school and swore like a teamster when she thought I wasn't listening," he said. "And she had a theory that coffee tasted better from a chipped cup. She had one specific cup she used every morning and refused to replace it even after the handle broke off completely." Mary focused on his voice, on the small solid details of a life that had been real and was still real in him. "What was her name again?" she said. "Your daughter." A pause. "Hope," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her steadily, his expression open and certain. "Hope," she said. "If you want to," he said. "Only if you want to." She felt her eyes do the thing they'd been doing very rarely and very honestly since she'd arrived on this mountain. She did not stop them this time. "Yes," she said. "I want to." He held her gaze. Something in his face was the most complete expression she had ever seen from him, grief and gratitude, and the particular courage of a man opening his hands around something he'd been holding closed for 3 years. "Then let's bring hope into the world," he said. She arrived in the early evening when the summer light was long, and the mountain was in the golden hour that made everything look like something remembered, rather than something happening. She was small and outraged and absolutely certain of her own importance from the first breath, which she announced at considerable volume. Caleb held her first because Mary's hands were shaking, and she asked him to, and he held her with the specific, careful competence of a man who has held small things before and understands the particular weight of them. He looked at her face, the new face furious and scrunched and completely herself, and Mary watched his face while he did. What she saw there was not something she could fully describe. It was the expression of a man encountering something he had told himself he would never have again, and finding that the having of it was nothing like what he had been afraid it would be. It was not replacement. It was not erasure. It was addition, the way love is always addition, never substitution. However much loss has told you otherwise. His jaw worked. His eyes did the thing that eyes do when a man refuses to cry, and the refusal is only partially successful. "Hello, Hope," he said very quietly. The baby, as if she understood that this was the relevant person addressing her, stopped crying for exactly 2 seconds. Then she started again because she had opinions. Caleb laughed, a real one, full and sudden and unguarded, the laugh of a man ambushed by joy in the best possible way. He brought Hope to Mary and settled her there, and Mary looked at her daughter and felt the specific enormity of a moment that cannot be prepared for regardless of how long you've known it was coming. "She's furious," Mary said. "She's Ellison stock," Caleb said. "What did you expect?" Mary looked up at him through the blur. She wasn't fighting anymore. "Stay," she said. "Already decided," he said. "I checked." The weeks after Hope arrived rearranged everything and nothing. Everything. The rhythms of the cabin shifted entirely around a small person who had no regard for prior schedules and an unwavering confidence in her own needs. The storage room Caleb had expanded became the room where Hope slept, lined with the practical warmth of a man who had spent 2 months making it right without saying that was what he was doing. The garden produced enough that they were not worried about winter. The medical cabinet, fully restocked on Caleb's last supply run to Duskwater, was organized with the precision of a man who had returned to his profession quietly and permanently. The coffee was still on the stove every morning. The east wall still stood. The mountain was still enormous and indifferent, and held them without ceremony. Caleb had resumed practicing. Not in a town, not with a shingle on a door, but in the way that made sense for where they lived. Word had moved through the county, the way word moves in rural places, and people came to the mountain when they needed someone. And he saw them in the cabin with the same focused presence he'd brought back from that first day with Mary and the medical cabinet, and he charged what people could pay, and did not charge what they couldn't. Mary helped when he needed her. She had her mother's knowledge and her own, and Caleb's library, and between them they could handle most of what the county required. Tibbs came up the mountain in October, riding slowly because his age had opinions about riding with a jar of his wife's preserved peaches, and a copy of the final territorial court ruling that confirmed Mary's title in full and ordered Varnell's mining operation to cease activity on the Ellison parcel. He sat at the table and held Hope while Mary made coffee, and the old man looked at the child with the expression of a man completing a long story. "Thomas would have been impossible about this baby," Tibbs said. "Absolutely impossible. You wouldn't have been able to get a word in about anything for the first year." "I know," Mary said, smiling. "He'd have had opinions about the name." "He'd have loved it," Mary said, after a day of pretending he needed to think about it. Tibbs laughed, the full-bellied laugh of an old man who knew exactly who Thomas Ellison had been. Then he looked at Caleb, who was leaning against the counter with his coffee and the particular stillness of a man comfortable in his own space. "You did right by her," Tibbs said. Caleb looked at the old man for a moment. "She did right by herself," he said. "I just tried to keep up." Tibbs looked at them both the way they occupied the room together. The language of two people who had learned each other, and nodded slowly, the nod of a man satisfied with how a thing has turned out. Thomas always said, Tibbs started and then stopped, tried again. He said the land wasn't about the land. He said he registered that parcel because he wanted there to be a place in the world that was hers. Somewhere that had her name on it. Somewhere she could always come back to. Tibbs looked at Mary. I think he got more than he was aiming for. Mary looked around the cabin. At the shelves with their medical books and the Gray's Anatomy with the separated spine. At the east wall they'd built together. At the garden outside the window, spent now in October, but promising next spring. At the man leaning against the counter who had walked into a saloon and set a bag of gold on a table and changed the direction of everything. He did, she said. He really did. Jeb Collins came in November. Mary heard about it from Reyes, who sent a letter. Jeb had come to the deputy's office in Harrow Creek, asking after his sister, and Reyes had told him she was well, and asked if Jeb wanted to send a message. Jeb had said he wasn't sure he had the right. Reyes wrote that part carefully, like a man transcribing something he thought mattered. Mary read the letter twice, sat with it for a full day. Then she wrote a response to Reyes, and asked him to give Jeb one sentence from her, she was all right, and she hoped he was learning to be. That was all. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. Maybe not in the full way that the word usually means. But something. The door left open a crack, not because he deserved it, but because she had enough now. Enough safety. enough solidity, enough people who would stay that she could afford the small mercy of not closing things entirely. She told Caleb about it that night. He listened without interrupting the way he always listened. "Do you think he'll come?" Caleb asked. "I don't know," she said. "I think he's ashamed. I think shame takes a long time to move through." "Does that change anything for you?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "What he did doesn't change because he's ashamed of it. But people can be more than the worst thing they did." She paused. "My father believed that. I'm trying to." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father sounds like a man I would have argued with a great deal and then agreed with completely." Mary smiled. "That's exactly what it was like," she said. "Every single time." He reached across the table that had held everything between them, all the planning and the grief and the careful negotiations of two people finding their way toward each other, and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah. I love you." She said it the way she said most things, straight, clear, without decoration, because she had learned that the direct version of a true thing was always stronger than the careful version. He was still for a moment. Then he turned her hand over in his, looked at it, looked at her. "I know," he said. And then, because Caleb Rowan said exactly what he meant, and nothing more and nothing less, "I love you too. Have for a while. Didn't know how to say it without it sounding like less than it is." "It doesn't," she said. "It sounds like exactly what it is." He looked at her with that open expression, the one that cost him, and that he gave her anyway every time without reservation now. "Yeah," he said softly. "I reckon it does." The winter came hard and early that year, the way Colorado winters sometimes do, arriving before anyone is entirely ready and refusing to apologize for it. The cabin held. Caleb had built it to hold and expanded it to hold more, and stocked it with the meticulous forward thinking of a man who had decided he had things to protect and intended to protect them properly. Hope was 4 months old when the first real snow came, and she had opinions about the cold that she expressed at volume, and was soothed by being carried, which Caleb did with a matter-of-fact ease that Mary watched sometimes from across the room with a feeling she had no words for, except that it was large and warm and rooted. She watched him carry Hope to the window to show her the snow, the way he held her, the way he talked to her in the low, direct voice he used for things he meant seriously, the way he looked at the child's face when she looked at the white world outside and went silent with the particular silence of a small person encountering something completely new. "She's looking at it," Caleb said, not turning from the window. "I can see," Mary said. "She's thinking about it." "She's 4 months old. She's thinking," he said with complete confidence. "She's going to have opinions about everything. I can already tell." Mary crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. Hope looked at the snow. Then she looked at Mary. Then she looked at Caleb. Then she looked at the snow again, apparently having concluded that all of this was connected in some important way. Her grandfather would have had the same look, Mary said. Probably, Caleb said. And her... She stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said the rest of it. They didn't need to. The cabin said it, the child between them said it, the mountain said it in its enormous indifferent way, that was somehow also not indifferent at all, just patient, the way large things are. Patient, waiting for the small things inside them to figure out what they already are. "Stay," Mary said, which was what she'd said the night everything changed in the courtroom of her own body. The word she'd used when she didn't yet have the fuller word. "Already decided," he said, which was what he'd said then. But now he turned from the window and looked at her directly, Hope still in his arms between them, and said the thing beyond it, the rest of what he meant. The part he'd been building toward since a saloon in Duskwater, and a bag of gold, and a woman who stood on a crate with her chin up and her eyes clear. "Mary," he said, "I'd like to make this right. Properly, if you'll let me." She understood what he was asking. The cabin understood. The mountain understood. "Ask me," she said. Marry me, he said. Simple, direct, certain. Not because you need to, because I want to spend every year I have left being the man this family deserves. She looked at him, at the burned steel eyes that had thawed at the face that had opened at the man who had come back to himself on this mountain, because something in her had called the best part of him home. Yes, she said. Just that. Just yes. Complete and solid and requiring nothing added to it. Hope, as if she had been waiting for the appropriate moment to weigh in, made a sound of emphatic agreement. They both looked at her. She approves, Mary said. She has excellent judgment, Caleb said. Mary put her hand on Hope's back, and Caleb's hand came to cover hers there, and the three of them stood at the window of a cabin on the north face of the Rockmore Pass, while the first real snow of winter came down outside, and none of them were alone, and all of them were home. In the spring, Pete rode up the mountain with a letter from the Territorial Land Office confirming the final resolution of the Ellison parcel case. Varnell convicted on 2 counts. His operation dismantled the boundary lines resurveyed and staked at the county's expense. Pete also brought a jar of Tibbs's wife's preserves and the information that Tibbs had told everyone in Harrow Creek that the whole thing had been resolved exactly as Thomas Ellison would have wanted, which was correctly and permanently. Mary read the letter standing in the doorway of the cabin while Hope sat in the garden in the morning sun, examining a tomato plant with the focused curiosity of a child discovering that the world contains an infinite number of things worth attention. Caleb came up behind her and read over her shoulder. She felt him exhale the long, quiet exhale of a matter finally completely closed. It's done, she said. It's done, he said. She leaned back against him, and he put his arms around her there in the doorway of the home they had built and held together, and they looked at their daughter in the garden with her grandfather's stubbornness and her mother's clear eyes and her whole enormous future arranged before her like country. You've been afraid to cross and have finally been given permission to walk into. Hope pulled a leaf off the tomato plant and held it up to the light, turning it in her small fingers, examining it with the absolute seriousness of someone who has just discovered that the world is worth looking at carefully. She was. It was. They were. And on that mountain, in that cabin, in that garden in the long spring morning, that smelled of soil and pine, and the particular clean air of high country, that was enough. That was in every way that counted everything. The mountain held them all, and this time they held it back.